Off the coast of the westernmost point in Africa is a cluster of islands making up the country of Cabo Verde. Around the bend is another island country called Sao Tome and Principe. And despite the fact that they are 3,700 kilometers away from each other, they couldn't be more similar. Not only are they both small island countries off the coast of Africa, but they were both settled and ruled by Portugal since the 1400s, both speak Portuguese with a predominantly mixed population, both were failed plantation economies, both got their independence in 1975, both were then ruled by one-party states until both were liberalized and democratized in the early 90s. Both were poor for most of their history, both dependent on the outside world, and both being some of the highest recipients of foreign aid on Earth. There also used to be quite large migrations between the countries in the colonial days as well. But there's one quite major difference between these countries. While Cabo Verde is rather arid and materially challenged, Sao Tome, a tropical island in the Gulf of Guinea, looked at all the oil-rich nations around it and decided it could be oil-rich too. You'd think oil would do a lot for a country, especially one as poor as Sao Tome in the late 90s. Just look at the supercars in Equatorial Guinea, or the megacities built in the middle of the Arabian Desert, or the Canadian equivalent in the taiga, and it's not hard to see that oil can do wonders for whoever finds it. But then you hear the horror stories of oil. The autocrats it helps keep in power, the civil wars it's caused, the killers of the flower moon, and you might think this substance is more trouble than it's worth. Yes, oil is an incredibly important material to our modern way of life, and yes, it makes those who pump it up incredibly rich, but countries which are dependent on oil have not performed well in the past. Think of the corruption in places like Venezuela, Iran, or Russia, whereas some resource-poor nations like the Netherlands and Japan have done remarkably well. Petrostate isn't exactly a compliment. And it's not just a political problem either. Resource-rich countries on average have slower growth than resource-poor ones, which is kind of counterintuitive. Shouldn't countries that have more stuff, especially valuable materials like oil, grow faster than those with nothing? Well, there are some reasons petrostates are cursed to slow growth. First, there's the argument that if you're well endowed, you might not put the work in to study and learn new skills, like a nation full of trust fund kids. But I don't think this is very convincing. Plenty of rich economies have developed healthy mining sectors without stifling innovation and business. Second, and a little related, is the fact that oil is a homogeneous product. Minerals are more or less the same product no matter where you get them from, or at least even if they have different grades, they act as the same end product. There's a low amount of spillover knowledge you get from developing an oil sector as compared to, say, developing a manufacturing sector. Every time you build a car or cast steel, it's a learning process, and that knowledge can be used to create new, better, more efficient products and processes, making more for less. But every time you mine a lump of copper, well, it's all the same. There's not much transferable knowledge in that. Third, the field is incredibly dependent on the global price of the commodity. Oil goes through boom and bust all the time. Boom here, and blam, bust. Not only does this obviously affect the revenue a country or government gets from the mineral sector, but it throws a wrench in any sort of long-term planning. Mexico once took out $80 billion of debt set against what they thought were going to be future oil profits, but when the price of oil crashed, they had no means to pay it back. Venezuela's government has gone through cycles of either excessive spending or huge cutbacks, depending on the price of oil that year, destroying trust in government services. But this volatility can and has been dealt with in many countries around the world. Stick it in a transparent sovereign wealth fund, invest the profits in other companies or projects, and boom, you have an oil-rich nation, assuming there's no political friction to do it. There are two things packaged with mineral wealth that are much harder to deal with though. One is economic and one is political. First, you may catch Dutch disease. Since your nation will almost never use up all the mineral wealth it finds, it'll become a large exporter of this stuff. Foreign buyers needing more of your currency to buy the mineral will buy your money, making it rise in value. This will make your ability to import much cheaper since it will take less of your cash to buy foreign goods. But think about it from the perspective of the farmers or manufacturers of the nation. Their ability to export will be hurt since it'll take more foreign monies to buy your goods. Other fields become less globally competitive through nothing except the fact that you found a mineral jackpot. Now, in theory, there's nothing wrong with this. Resources will shift to the mining sector and the country will be just as globally competitive as it was before. But mining and oil are incredibly machine-heavy fields that don't employ a lot of workers. When money flows to oil away from farming or factories, unemployment rises and the country becomes dependent on a sector that could very well crash at any moment, hurting innovation and assurance in the future. Second, it's a cutthroat game. There's a lot of money to be made just by being one of the top dogs in mining or being well politically connected. A resource rent is the extra value gotten out of the ground minus all the costs to develop and operate the business. Obviously, a little bit of an incentive is needed to develop the mine in the first place, or else we'd have no metal, but the fight to control these lucrative resource rents can be deadly, and they often are. There becomes incentives for corruption, expropriation, autocracy, and violence, all of which are terrible for the average person, let alone the trust in political institutions or the trust you'll be better off tomorrow than today. The best way to deal with Dutch disease is to spend the oil rent on productive investments to keep other sectors alive and thriving. But the oil rent must be kept away from national politics or else it can easily corrupt the government. Being a petrostate is a very fine line that not many countries get right. Too many fall to become completely dependent on it, and too many are corrupted by the power the oil rent brings. Both kill the country. So how'd finding oil go in Sao Tome? Did they get rich? Did they break the curse? No. It didn't go well. In the late 90s, they divided their exclusive economic zone, the waters around their country which only they are entitled to, into 19 different blocks for the exploration and production of oil, as well as a joint development zone with Nigeria. And as the rights to these blocks were being auctioned on starting in 2003, there were a lot of, let's say, foreign interests coming to the island. BP, Total Energies, Shell, and even Angola's state-owned oil company got a slice to explore the blocks for Petro. Some of the bids for them were higher than twice the Sao Tomean GDP. In other words, there was good money coming to the island and tons of competition to secure the oil rent for yourself. We can see the results through a study looking at over 2,000 household surveys conducted after Sao Tome found oil. They asked people various questions about public services in multiple different categories and general corruption in the country in two periods, pre-oil and post-oil. But because people's memories are hazy and they'll always talk about the past with rose-tinted glasses, there were controls for time pessimism as well as comparing the results to various surveys done in Cabo Verde, the remarkably similar country which never hit a mineral jackpot. And when using these controls, the results are clear. Not only did the World Bank report a divergence in corruption perceptions after Sao Tome found oil, but so did individual Sao Tomeans on these surveys. Across all public services, corruption increased after finding oil, but it was in the areas of high competition where the highest increases in corruption were reported. These were scholarship allocation, with a kid who goes overseas to school presumably more likely to be elected down the road, state subsidies, and vote buying, which increased the most. Many local politicians use their money today to try to secure their slice of the rent in the future. But less competitive areas like license approval and infrastructure development saw the lowest increase in perceived corruption. What's more is that urban Sao Tomeans reported more corruption than those in the outskirts of the island. The country's population was only around 150,000 when these surveys took place, so there would not be a massive cultural difference between the city and the countryside, especially on an island as small as this, meaning it really is just areas which had the highest potential for oil rents that saw the most competition to get to it. The resource curse lives, and Sao Tome suffers with public investment crowded out, slow growth, and high poverty. The moral of the story is, it is absolutely necessary to responsibly manage mineral wealth if it is found. It's important to have transparent laws that show where the oil money is going, what is being invested in, and to have spending limits on the mineral revenue. If you don't, vultures are going to come in and corrode your country. This needs to be done ASAP, preferably before you extract anything out of the ground, before a precedent of corruption can be established. But Sao Tome did that. They have their frameworks about oil spending, they have taxation rules, and they have a model for production sharing. But what they don't have, and what they never found, was oil. That's right, all these laws, all these papers about a brighter future, and all this corruption was created without even a drop of petroleum produced. It was all based on seismic data. It was just a hope. The resource curse can permeate a country just through the thought of future profits, which gets at a much larger story and more important lesson. If Sao Tome hasn't produced oil yet, why do they still lag behind Cabo Verde? Perhaps it's due to geography. Sao Tome is much more tropical than Cabo Verde, with the effect of diseases and a history of plantations lasting to today. The island was actually the first European plantation-based economy, even being the largest exporter of sugar before Brazil was colonized. Then it became the first African region to cultivate and export cacao, and again became the world's largest exporter of it in the early 1900s. For most of its history, Sao Tome was reliant on the single export for economic growth. In 2000, cacao made over 95% of their exports, and at independence, plantations made up over 90% of the cultivated land area. Because the use of forced paid labor continued well after slavery was abolished in the Portuguese Empire, thousands of contract workers would be shipped in from the other colonies to work in these brutal and degrading conditions, limiting most people from opportunity. Even to this day, around 60% of the population works in agriculture in niche luxury product markets. Perhaps because of this tiny size, distant location, and impoverished past, Sao Tome is dependent on food imports, foreign aid, remittances, and any source of foreign money they can get. Until 2016, they even had financing deals with Taiwan for being one of the few countries to recognize them. But yeah, China took that. Or maybe Sao Tome failed because of its management. Under the Portuguese, they were stunted by a corrupt plantation system which tried to suck all the chocolate it could out of the island. But when a coup in Portugal triggered decolonization across its empire, Sao Tome was then free and ruled by the MLSTP, the Movement for the Liberation of Sao Tome and Principe. Under Manuel Pinto da Costa, Sao Tome was a shut-off, centrally planned economy mainly consisting of state-owned agricultural operations with only one legal party allowed to operate: them. Again, the island developed quite little under this rule. After constant deficits and stagnating cacao production, the island then reformed in the late 80s with the push of the IMF to remove many price controls and subsidies, privatize most state-owned assets, open up to the rest of the world, and most importantly, democratize. Sao Tome was one of the first African countries to have a fully functioning multi-party system with regular elections since 1991. And to this day, it is generally free, transparent, and open to the free press. Perhaps living on a small island brought more personality-based politics and more trust in the system and their neighbors. Or maybe not. The military attempted a coup in 1995. There is another attempt in 2003 after oil was thought to be found. Former President Frederic de Menezes has admitted his campaign was funded with foreign oil money. And remember, local vote buying also increased after finding oil. Things are not all smooth sailing in the government, especially after their scramble to get a non-existent resource rent. That being said, in recent years it has been growing quite a lot, but as a still low-income, unequal, impoverished nation which makes most of its money through cacao or palm oil farming, the effects of its geography and leaders have been clear. Compare this to Cabo Verde, which had a quite similar trajectory for most of its history. The islands here were also set up by the Portuguese to be a plantation extractor, but were never great at the whole monoculture thing from the fairly dry nature of the islands. Because of its location, the islands were then used as a major entrepot zone in the Portuguese slave trade, suffering through droughts, poverty, and famine led by the Portuguese. When the Suez Canal opened and steamships became mainstream, that killed the islands even more. Fishing, whaling, trading, and mining salt were essentially the only things the Portuguese came here for. What I'm saying is, these islands were also crushingly poor and suffered under the same institutions Sao Tome did. During the wave of decolonization, Cabo Verde had a joint independence movement with Guinea-Bissau, this little country here with a series of conflicts on the mainland fighting for the independence of them and the islands. It was achieved in 1975, but in 1980 the joint party split and the African Party of the Independence of Cape Verde ruled the islands, again as a one-party socialist state-run economy under a man named Aristides Pereira. And again, Cabo Verde undertook a series of market-based reforms in the late 80s, whilst also becoming one of Africa's first democracies holding regular elections since 1991. Like the other island, Cabo Verde is also highly dependent on the outside world. Through foreign aid, foreign investment, mainly for tourist and infrastructure projects, those tourism revenues, imports, commerce, and with twice as many Cabo Verdeans living outside the islands than in them, remittances too. And even if their exports resemble the Sao Tomeans' agricultural type, with the bulk of it being fish products, it doesn't seem to weigh down on their growth. For some reason, Cabo Verde's growth has been steadily higher than Sao Tome's. Perhaps it's just because they have better industries. A quarter of their economy and 40% of jobs are based around tourism, with a healthy construction sector needed to back that growth up. And as the links between Africa and Europe grow, it's becoming an increasingly important logistics hub too. Cabo Verde is not like Sao Tome. It's made up of 10 main islands, 9 of which are inhabited. Infrastructure development like building ports and airports was absolutely necessary to create one market between the islands and to transform its location into its competitive advantage. Much of this infrastructure was financed through overseas money, but the important part is foreign investors felt confident enough about them to invest their savings into these, no offense, absolutely impoverished islands. And that's because Cabo Verde has been stable and prudent. The political scene has had no major bumps like Sao Tome has. The government is very open with their budgets and finances, it prioritizes macroeconomic stability, and the country even ranks as the African country with the lowest corruption. So through good governance, being open to almost all foreign partners and incentives to invest, investment came. Even if the country is still reliant on aid, imports, and debt, it is stable and has been one of the fastest growing African economies, at least until the financial crisis hit. When money was put back into human resources, it's insane how much the country developed. At independence, 60% of Cabo Verdeans were illiterate and the average lifespan was 49 years old. Today, 99% of people can read and they live 74 years, 7 years longer than their Sao Tomean friends. Infrastructure differences are night and day between the countries, and the average Cabo Verdean is over twice as rich as the average Sao Tomean. Perhaps even if it makes its way in spirit, the resource curse really does exist. If not, well, the difference between rising and falling corruption levels absolutely made a world of difference for the countries. Don't be corrupt.